Let's turn back to the NATO summit in Madrid, where the alliance is outlining a new, stronger vision for the future. It says the leaders at the summit yesterday declared Russia the most significant and direct threat to their country's peace and security. For the first time, the alliance also issued a warning about China, accusing it of bullying its neighbors and forming a strategic partnership with Moscow that poses a challenge to the West. The leaders included threats presented by Beijing into a new blueprint for its strategy going forward. President Biden yesterday unveiled plans to increase U.S. military presence across Europe. The president said the U.S. will deploy additional troops to Romania on a rotating basis and enhance other rotational deployments in the Baltic states. Joining us now from Madrid, NBC News senior international correspondent Keir Simmons. Keir, what's the latest there?
Well, Willie, we're standing by for those news conferences by NATO leaders, including President Biden. Expect a lot of crowing, and I think Richard Haass was right speaking earlier, a lot of questions. One of the big questions, what changed between President Biden and President Erdogan? Remember, Biden once called Erdogan a autocrat. Erdogan was the last NATO leader to congratulate President Biden on his election victory, and yet this week they have looked like bros. We've heard from people in the room that the Turkish defense minister was walking around yesterday saying we got what we wanted. Is that F-16s, US F-16s for Turkey? It does appear to revolve around events on Tuesday. A senior administration official this week saying there was a call from President Biden to President Erdogan. But Willie, we've also been talking to the Finnish foreign minister who was in a 11th hour meeting with Turkish officials on Tuesday. Listen to how he describes how it went right down to the wire.
Well, I think the first 4 hours with the Turkish delegation, with Sweden and with the NATO Secretariat, of course, it was tough. 2 hours, first things are not moving anywhere, and then comes the coffee break, and as always, during the coffee break, people start to have a little bit new ideas, and then we could process it.
So there appears, at least on the surface, to have been some deals done. For example, with this issue of members of the Kurdish community living in Finland. Have deals been done?
I can say, of course, only from the Finnish side that no deals are there. We have said to Turkey that we follow our own legislation. We are not going to change our legislation. If there comes some request from Turkey, we will process them accordingly.
You made no promises?
No promises. No promises, because we cannot, of course, overcome our national legislation on these issues.
No promises, no deals done, and yet Turkey now asking for 33 Kurdish militants they say should be sent to Turkey from Sweden and Finland. The Finnish foreign minister, Willie, also telling us that there was, he said, a good deal of pressure on Turkey from members of Congress, a bipartisan effort, he said. So just another example of how geopolitics has shifted this week. Remember, I mean, Turkey is just so important. They are involved in the negotiations to try and release that blockade in the Black Sea that threatens such a food crisis around the world. How things change, frankly.
Yeah, it's amazing. I also like, Keir, how you describe a bilateral meeting basically as broing out between Presidents Biden and Erdogan. NBC's Keir Simmons live from Madrid. Keir, thanks so much, as always. Richard, you kind of zeroed in on something in that initial report, and that is the China piece of this, that NATO stepped out pretty aggressively and talked about China and pushing back against it. China with a chilly response, as you can imagine, saying basically stay out of the Pacific. We got that. This is our territory. What did you make of this step from NATO?
Lots of moving parts. The lead story is obviously the strengthening of NATO against Russia, but also we're getting Europeans doing more in NATO, not just the United States, which means the United States is freed up to do more in Asia and to deal with the Chinese challenge. This is the 25th anniversary, among other things, of the Chinese takeover of Hong Kong. Xi Jinping left the mainland for the first time in 2.5 years, goes to Hong Kong. China violated all of its international commitments and how it's dealt with Hong Kong. It's become more repressive at home, less market-oriented, much more militarily assertive. So we now face a world where the United States is confronting Russia in Europe, China in Asia, the threat of a war against Taiwan. That's one of the reasons Ukraine is so important, Willie. We do not want China learning the wrong lessons about that aggression pays here. And an interesting question in Europe going forward is, will the Europeans work with us in sanctioning China to make clear to China that if it ever were to move against Taiwan, it could face the sort of pressure that Russia is facing now? So this is a really interesting thing. We're taking what was largely a regional alliance, NATO, a European alliance, and the idea is whether we can in some ways globalize it. This is a big, big test for American foreign policy.
It really is a big test. And Richard, you know, it's fascinating what we've seen so many things happen over the past 6 months. But at least to my mind, it looks like the world is settling into a tri-polar world. You've got the United States, you've got the EU, and you've got China. Russia has a GDP even less, of course, than Texas. While you've got the U.S. over $20 trillion a year GDP, the EU over $20 trillion a year GDP plus Britain, and then, of course, China, a GDP over $20 trillion. It is fascinating to see, again, Joe Biden. I think there's a growing recognition inside this administration that they can't behave the way Donald Trump did. You can't push people around. You can't insult allies. That this is a battle between the West and the East. Even if it's not a hot battle with Xi as president, it's a cold battle. So that's why we're seeing these somewhat jarring photos of the president with Erdogan. The president talking about the Saudis and rebuilding the alliance with the Saudis out of realism, out of necessity, because the battle only gets more difficult from here. And we're not talking about Russia. It is, of course, as you said, China as well.
Yeah, I think you're right, Joe. The administration in some ways has been mugged or at least sobered up by reality. And what you have is, they've realized you can't have democracy and human rights at the center of American foreign policy. Doesn't mean we ignore them, but whether it's Turkey or Saudi Arabia, we've got to focus on the real threats. We've got a real threat in Europe with Russia. We've got a real threat in Asia with China. We've got to work with partners, even if they're not necessarily democratic. And that, by the way, is a larger point for American foreign policy. We can't, whether it's dealing with climate change or China or Russia or anything else, we can't necessarily choose the partners we want to have. We've got to work with the partners that exist. So this is reality, and this is a demanding world. And that's what I think we're seeing here. We've got a lot on our plates. We can't do it alone, and we can't be quite so choosy as to who we decide to work with.